I wasn't looking for giants when I started researching Appalachian coal mining history. I was tracing labour organisation in the years before the United Mine Workers consolidated power in the region, work camps, company towns, the brutal extraction economy that fueled America's Industrial Revolution, the kind of research that produces neat columns of tonnage figures and accident reports and moves on. Standard labour history, but then I found the photographs, not illustrations in a pamphlet, not exaggerated folk tales from mountain storytellers, not the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a conspiracy pamphlet. Photographs. Actual photographic evidence from the 1880s through the early 1910s, showing work crews at coal tipples, at shaft entrances, on the outskirts of mining operations throughout the Appalachian Range, and among the ordinary men standing in those images, figures of impossible scale. The proportions were so dramatic they looked like tricks of perspective at first, except they weren't. The ground was level, the shadows landed correctly, the tipple structures in the background gave you consistent reference points across the entire frame. The men standing next to those structures were clearly, verifiably normal sized, and the figures standing among them were not. These images predated any sophisticated manipulation technology. They were taken with large format glass plate cameras by company photographers, by labour investigators, by survey teams contracted to document mine output and workforce composition. And that's when the official explanations stopped making sense. The deeper I investigated, the more photographs surfaced. Glass plate negatives held in West Virginia State Archives, album and prints from federal labour investigation files compiled during the 1890s and early 1900s. Gelatin silver prints from company records once held by now defunct coal operators in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. In image after image, in camp after camp, across the full length of the Appalachian coalfields, the same configuration. Work crews of 15, 20, sometimes 30 men, lined up at shift change or posing beside the day's coal output. And among them, consistently, individuals who stood 9, 10, sometimes 11 feet tall. Not one. Not an isolated medical anomaly documented for scientific curiosity. Multiple individuals, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single crew photograph, standing with their colleagues in the grey morning light outside a mine shaft entrance, wearing the same canvas work clothes, the same heavy boots, the same carbide lamps clipped to their caps. The Smithsonian Institution has materials from the 1900 labour surveys that reference these individuals. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division holds documentation from the industrial survey expeditions that swept through the region between 1895 and 1910. British coal investment firms heavily capitalised in Appalachian operations during this period kept meticulous photographic records of their workforce and infrastructure. And there, in those investors' documentation packages sent across the Atlantic to reassure London shareholders, they appear without comment. Men of extraordinary size integrated into the labour force, unremarkable. Always the same pattern. Document, catalogue, never investigate. Never ask why. Why were there so many concentrated specifically in coal extraction? Why do the photographs cluster between 1880 and 1912, then abruptly stop? Why do labour investigator journals describe these individuals not as medical curiosities, but as productive workers specifically valuable for their capacity to handle work in deep, low-clearance seams that exhausted normal men in hours? And here's what makes the evidence impossible to dismiss. These giants aren't posed for display. They're working, mid-shift, covered in coal dust the same as everyone around them. The photographs weren't taken to showcase anomalies. They were documenting mine operations, workforce headcounts, output verification, safety compliance records, and the giants were simply there. Unremarkable enough that photographers didn't bother to explain or highlight them. Once you notice it, the physical evidence multiplies in ways that can't be explained away. I started examining the mining equipment itself. Standard hand drilling equipment from Appalachian operations of this period runs large by any reasonable comparison to contemporary tools from European mines or from Western American silver and copper operations. Drill handles recovered from sealed sections of abandoned mines in Mingo County and Harlan County measure significantly longer than their documented European equivalents. Standard explanation: regional manufacturing variation. Except these same regions were importing significant quantities of equipment directly from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati manufacturers who supplied mines nationwide. Why would identical suppliers produce dramatically different tool proportions for one specific region? The evidence embedded in the tools themselves is harder to explain away. Grip circumferences on recovered pick handles from several Appalachian sites measure well beyond what would be ergonomically practical for a standard adult hand. Not worn or reshaped by use, original manufactured dimensions, a normal man gripping such a handle loses the mechanical control that makes a pick useful. The tool becomes awkward, inefficient, but for a hand proportionally scaled to a 9-foot frame, the dimensions become exactly right. The coal cars tell a related story. Narrow gauge mine cars used for hauling coal from the working face to the shaft bottom were, in most operations, pushed by hand before the introduction of mule haulage and later electric motors. Recovered mine cars from several operations in the Pocahontas coalfield of southern West Virginia are built to pushing height specifications that would require a man well over 7 feet tall to push with proper body mechanics, the kind of upright, hip-driven push that doesn't destroy your back over a 12-hour shift. For a man of average height, the push bar height forces a bent posture that's not just uncomfortable but structurally damaging over time. Yet these cars were in daily operational use for decades. Museum cataloguers have labelled them experimental design or transitional technology. They're found in working mine contexts, showing years of coal dust accumulation and operational wear, in operations that ran these cars continuously for a decade or more. There was nothing experimental about them. Then there are the mine structures themselves. Appalachian coal operations in this period weren't deep shaft operations in most cases. They were drift mines and slope mines, following seams into the hillside. The entries, the portals, the interior heading dimensions were theoretically determined by seam height. You cut just enough rock to extract coal economically. Every inch of extra roof rock you took meant more blasting, more labour, more material to move. Operators were aggressively cost-conscious. Yet portal dimensions at dozens of abandoned mine sites throughout the central Appalachian coalfields are significantly larger than the coal seams they accessed would require. Documented seam heights of 4 and 5 feet, typical for the region, don't explain entry portals standing 8 and 9 feet high. The standard explanation involves ventilation requirements and equipment clearance. Except contemporary mining engineering manuals from the period specify portal dimensions well below what these sites exhibit, and the mines were using equipment that fit those standard specifications with room to spare. The surface structures are even harder to explain away. Company housing in isolated Appalachian mining camps, the structures built furthest from the main settlements, designated in company records as housing for heavy labour crews or extraction teams, consistently show architectural proportions that don't match the company housing built for the general workforce. Door frames standing 10 feet high, interior ceiling heights approaching 12 feet in structures that are otherwise built with absolute minimum material usage, because waste in company town construction came directly out of profit margins. Sleeping platforms at heights that would leave an average man's feet dangling uncomfortably. Tables and benches at heights calibrated to someone significantly taller than the standard workforce. Not in one camp, not in two. In camp remnants documented across 5 states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, wherever the oldest and most remote mining operations left structural remains. Why would operators who squeezed every board foot of lumber, who built housing barely large enough for a man to turn around in, consistently build the heavy labour housing too large, unless it wasn't too large for the men assigned to it. The photographic evidence, examined systematically, is devastating to conventional explanations. The scale confirmation available in these images is unusually reliable, better than in many historical photograph collections, because mine operations provided an abundance of fixed dimension reference objects. Timber support sets in mine headings were manufactured to standard dimensions. Coal cars were built to documented specifications. The mine structures themselves had known dimensions recorded in company engineering files that survive in several state archives. When you establish scale from these reference objects and then measure the human figures in the frame, the numbers are consistent across dozens of independent images. Individuals standing 9 to 11 feet tall appear in crew photographs from operations in 5 states, spanning 3 decades, captured by different photographers using different camera equipment under different conditions. The consistency isn't what you'd get from perspective tricks. Perspective distortion isn't consistent. It varies based on camera position, focal length, distance. What you see in these images is consistent in a way that only represents one thing: people who were actually that size. Their hands are visible in many of the higher quality photographs. Hands holding pick handles, hands resting on the shoulders of standing colleagues, hands proportional to the bodies they belong to, not deformed, not swollen, and not showing evidence of acromegaly's characteristic bone thickening, simply scaled, everything in correct proportion, just fundamentally larger, and their faces in the photographs where detail permits it, not the characteristic coarsening of the facial features that comes with pituitary gigantism. Normal faces, just large. The outside context is provided by federal investigators who weren't looking for giants either. The labour investigations that swept through Appalachian coal country between 1900 and 1912 produced thousands of pages of testimony and observation. Most of it concerns wages, hours, company store debt, safety conditions. But threaded through multiple independent investigators' reports are casual references to workers of extraordinary physical size encountered at isolated operations. A 1903 Bureau of Labor Statistics field report covering operations in McDowell County, West Virginia, describes encountering a section crew in terms so clinical they clearly weren't meant to be remarkable. Several workers of unusual stature employed in the heading operations, apparently of local mountain extraction, whose physical dimensions considerably exceeded normal parameters. Foreman indicated such work as particularly effective in heavy extraction work. The 1907 Inland Steel Internal Survey of their Appalachian acquisitions, recently digitized from private records donated to an Indiana Historical Society, contains photographs of several operations with visible large-scale individuals in the workforce, captioned only with operation names and dates. No note of anything unusual, as if large men in the crews were unremarkable background detail not worth commenting on. 3 meters, 10 feet. Noted clinically, then the report moves on to discuss coal quality and haulage infrastructure, as if the investigators had more pressing matters to document. Then the record stops. After approximately 1913, the photographs cease. Not gradually, as one era of photographic technology gives way to another. Abruptly, mine crew photographs from the mid-1910s onward, and there are many, as photographic documentation of workforce and operations actually becomes more common with the spread of smaller, cheaper cameras, show only normal-sized men. What changed? The operations didn't stop. Coal extraction in Appalachia expanded dramatically during World War I and into the 1920s. Photographic documentation became more thorough, not less. Yet the large individuals who appeared unremarkably in pre-war crew photographs simply vanish from the record. The United Mine Workers organizing drives of this period provide some archival cover for the disappearance, labor unrest, shifting workforce composition, the mechanization of some operations. But these explanations don't survive contact with the specifics. The individuals visible in photographs before the cutoff didn't leave because of mechanization. The operations where they're documented continued to use hand labour for years afterward. They simply stop appearing in the record, stop being photographed, stop being mentioned in labour reports, stop existing in official history. British investor records show the same discontinuity. German industrial surveys of American coal resources, which included photographic documentation through 1911, simply omit what they had previously documented without comment. It isn't that later records contradict earlier ones. The later records simply behave as though there's nothing unusual to observe, while the earlier records casually document something extraordinary. As if sometime around 1912 or 1913, a collective decision was made about what was appropriate to record, what was permissible to see. The physical evidence persists in ways that can't be entirely erased. Antique dealers and mining salvage operations throughout central Appalachia still occasionally surface the oversized implements, picks with handles that no normal man can swing effectively, drill steel in diameters that exceed any documented equipment specifications from the period, loading shovels with blade dimensions that would make them unmanageable for standard-sized operators, all showing the wear patterns of regular use. All functional tools recovered from working mine contexts, not display pieces or ceremonial objects. County historical societies catalogue them as oversized specimens or unclear industrial application, despite the fact that they're recovered from mine sites and bear unmistakable evidence of mining use, the coal dust ground into wood grain that no amount of time removes, the specific wear patterns that come from striking rock and coal, the chemical residue from the black powder used in pre-electric blasting operations. The alternative explanation, that these were everyday tools for workers whose size made such proportions practical, goes unspoken in institutional documentation. The questions such an explanation would raise are apparently too disruptive. Too many implications for what we think we know about who built the industrial foundation of American energy production, who accomplished those feats of extraction in the years when coal powered everything. What disturbs me most isn't the evidence itself. When you present these photographs to historians of American labour, they acknowledge the images are authentic, nod at the scale discrepancies, and explain them away as perspective effects, without ever explaining how perspective effects remain consistent across hundreds of images, multiple photographers, different decades, different camera technologies. When you show the tools to curators, they catalogue them as manufacturing anomalies. When you describe the architectural proportions of the remote camp structures, you're told they reflect regional building practices without any attempt to explain why those practices would consistently waste scarce material on excess height. It's not active denial, it's systematic incuriosity. Questions that aren't asked because following them to their conclusions would require rewriting narratives that are, at this point, institutional. But the questions remain. Why did individuals of extraordinary size concentrate specifically in Appalachian coal extraction during this particular historical window? Why do company records describe them as valued, specifically recruited for heavy work, rather than as curiosities or medical cases? Why does their documentation cease precisely as labour organising and federal oversight of mine operations increases, precisely as the workforce becomes more formally documented, more officially counted? And what happened to them? There's no record of departure, no corresponding appearance of large individuals in other regional labour forces, no demographic event that would explain the disappearance. They simply stop being recorded. I keep returning to one photograph in particular. It's undated but contextually placed in the early 1900s, recovered from the estate of a mine foreman whose family donated a collection of operational photographs to a county historical society in southwestern Virginia. The image shows a shift change at a drift mine entrance. 6 men coming out of the portal, black with coal dust. All of them are normal size. One is not. He's not centered in the frame. Not highlighted, not positioned for emphasis. Coal dust on his face and hands like everyone else. He's simply part of the shift coming out of the mountain. But his head clears the portal entrance that the other men duck under, his hand on the back of the man in front of him. A casual collegial gesture. He is not a tall man, he is a giant, and no one in the photograph is looking at him the way you'd look at something extraordinary. They're colleagues, co-workers, just people finishing a shift. We made them impossible by pretending they never existed. We turned documented reality into forbidden speculation by simply refusing to ask the questions the documentation raised. We erased individuals who were, apparently, ordinary enough in their own time that the foreman who kept this photograph for the rest of his life filed it among routine operational records rather than as a specimen of the remarkable. The mountains hold what the history books don't. The tools remain in salvage yards. The oversized camp structures still stand in the hollows, slowly returning to the hillsides, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why were they there? Why were they forgotten? And what else have we agreed quietly not to see?